Get on the ground now. Hands where I can see them. The voice was muffled but laced with an unearned authority that grated on my nerves, even more so than being woken up at 3 in the morning. I squinted through my front door's peephole at the two figures standing on my porch. They were dressed in cheap, black tactical gear that looked like it had been bought from a Halloween store, complete with knockoff security patches. One of them was holding a mag light, like a club. This was the absurd climax of a month-long battle with my HOA over a $22 fine for my garden hose being visible from the street for 3 hours. My name is Alex. I'm a former military canine handler, and the men outside my door had no idea that on the other side of the wood, my two Belgian Malinois, judge and jury, were at a low growl, waiting for a single command. The HOA president, a woman who treated our suburban neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, had finally gone too far. She thought she could use hired thugs to scare me into submission. She was about to find out just how badly she had misjudged me. Stick around for this crazy story, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I promise the ending is worth it. It all started, as these things often do, with something laughably insignificant. I'd spent a Saturday afternoon pressure washing my driveway, and after rinsing everything down, I'd left the garden hose coiled next to the spigot. Not thrown in a heap, mind you, coiled, neatly. I went inside, got distracted by a project, and forgot about it. The next day, there it was, a crisp white envelope stuck to my door, secured with a piece of tape so aggressively it peeled off a sliver of paint. Inside was a violation notice from the Architectural Control Committee, a grand title for our HOA president, Brenda, and two of her closest sycophants. The violation? Improper storage of landscaping equipment. A direct quote. The fine was a nominal, $22. It wasn't the money, of course. It was the principle. It was the sheer, unadulterated pettiness of it. I had lived in the neighborhood for about a year, a quiet corner of what I thought was suburbia bliss. I bought the house for its large yard, a perfect space for judge and jury to run. I kept to myself, maintained my property to a standard far exceeding the HOA's own vague guidelines, and paid my dues on time. I was, by all accounts, a model resident. Brenda, on the other hand, was a character straight out of a cautionary tale. A woman in her late 50s with a helmet of perfectly coiffed, unnaturally blonde hair. She drove a pristine white Lexus SUV and seemed to patrol the streets with a singular mission: to find fault. She saw the neighborhood not as a community, but as a scale model of her own perfect world, and any deviation was a personal affront. Her husband, a perpetually weary-looking man named Gary, was the HOA treasurer, a position that allowed them complete and unchecked control over the neighborhood's finances. My first mistake was trying to reason with her. I called the number on the notice. Brenda answered on the second ring, her voice already dripping with condescension. Blackwell Residence, Brenda speaking, as if it were the White House. I calmly explained the situation, that it was a simple oversight, that the hose had been there for a matter of hours. I expected a simple, "Oh, okay, don't worry about it this time." Instead, I got a lecture. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carver," she said, her voice tightening. "We can't have exceptions. An exception for you means an exception for everyone. And then where would we be? Anarchy? Your hose was clearly visible from the street. The bylaws are very specific." I tried again, pointing out that the bylaws she cited referred to lawnmowers and wheelbarrows left in front yards, not a neatly coiled hose. "It's equipment, Mr. Carver. It's used for landscaping. The committee's interpretation is final." Her tone was that of a weary monarch explaining basic governance to a particularly slow peasant. It was the committee's interpretation part that set my teeth on edge. The committee was her, Gary, and a woman named Carol, who seemed to agree with whatever Brenda said, likely in exchange for being allowed to have 6 inches of unapproved decorative fencing around her petunias. This wasn't my first rodeo with nonsensical bureaucracy. My 12 years in the military had inoculated me against petty tyrants. I knew there were 2 ways to handle this. You could roll over, or you could dig in. Rolling over on 22 felt like surrendering a part of my soul. So I dug in. I sent a formal, written appeal, as outlined in the HOA covenants. I cited the specific bylaw, quoted its text, and attached a photo of my neatly coiled hose. I argued that the intent of the rule was to prevent visual blight from large, intrusive equipment, not to penalize a homeowner for a minor, temporary oversight. It was a well-reasoned, respectful letter. I felt it was bulletproof. The response came a week later. A single sentence on official HOA letterhead. The committee has reviewed your appeal, and the initial finding is upheld. The fine of $22 is due within 15 days. No explanation. No counterargument. Just a diktat. The passive-aggressive escalations began shortly after. My trash cans, which I put out the night before pickup like every other resident for the past decade, were suddenly in violation. A notice appeared, stating they could not be put out before 5 a.m. on pickup day. A new rule, apparently invented just for me. Then came a notice about the small, decorative veteran's flag I kept in my garden bed. It was, according to Brenda, an unapproved yard sign. This was particularly insulting. I saw her watching me from her window as I read the notice, a faint, triumphant smirk on her face. Each new notice came with a new fine, piling on top of the original $22. The neighbors were sympathetic but useless. One of them, a friendly guy named Mike who lived across the street, caught me one afternoon while I was retrieving another one of Brenda's love letters from my door. "Just pay it, man," he said, his voice low as if she might have parabolic microphones aimed at us. "It's not worth the headache. She'll make your life a living hell. Ask the Gallaghers." The Gallaghers, I learned, had been forced to rip out a beautiful mature rose bush because Brenda decided it was a non-conforming shrub. They fought her and lost, eventually selling their house and moving. She had bled them dry with fines and lawyers' fees. Mike's wife, Sarah, was a bit more fiery. "She's a menace," she whispered fiercely. "She tried to fine us because our son's bicycle was on the lawn for 20 minutes. Gary is just as bad. He walks around with a clipboard, measuring people's grass with a ruler. They're on a power trip. They were enablers, trapped by fear and apathy. They hated Brenda but were unwilling to risk her wrath. Their warnings, meant to cow me into submission, had the opposite effect. They solidified my resolve. This wasn't about a hose anymore. It was about a bully who was terrorizing an entire community, and no one was willing to stand up to her. I decided that if I was going to be the target, I might as well make it worth my while. I started my own research. I got a copy of the full HOA covenants and governing documents, a dusty 3-ring binder that Gary grudgingly handed over after I formally requested it. I spent a weekend reading it cover to cover, highlighting passages, making notes. What I found was a mess of vague language, contradictory rules, and, most importantly, specific procedures for enforcement and fining that Brenda was flagrantly ignoring. There was, for example, a required 30-day cure period for first-time violations. My hose fine was demanded in 15 days. Fines also had to be approved by a majority vote of the entire board at a public meeting, not just by Brenda's committee. This was my ammunition. My next step was to pay the original $22 fine. I sent a check via certified mail, along with a letter. In the letter, I stated that I was paying the fine under protest to avoid further escalation, but that I formally disputed its legitimacy based on the procedural errors I had uncovered. I listed them, point by point, citing the bylaws by section and paragraph. I also formally disputed all subsequent fines for the trash cans and the flag, as they were issued without the proper due process. I copied the entire board, not just Brenda and Gary. I wanted everyone on record. That letter, I believe, is what pushed Brenda over the edge. She wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a lazy one. She had built her little empire on the assumption that no one would ever read the fine print. I had not only read it, I had thrown it back in her face. Her response was not a letter. It was silence. A cold, ominous silence that lasted for 2 weeks. I thought, naively, that maybe she had backed down. That my documented by-the-book approach had shown her I wasn't an easy target. I was wrong. The silence was her regrouping, planning her next move. The bill for the accumulated disputed fines arrived, now totaling over 200, with a new line item: late fees and collection costs. At the bottom of the invoice, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "Final notice. Failure to pay will result in further collection action." It was a declaration of war. That was 3 days before the knock at the door. I knew something was coming, but I never anticipated this level of insane escalation. And so, as I stood there in my hallway, listening to the pounding on my door and the ridiculous commands being shouted through it, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The fight had come to my doorstep. Brenda had outsourced her tyranny, and my two highly trained, deeply loyal partners were awake, alert, and ready to meet them. The absurdity of it all was almost funny. All this over a garden hose. She thought a couple of guys in cheap costumes could intimidate a man who had spent years handling dogs trained for the realities of combat. The real irony was that the HOA bylaws, the very ones she loved to weaponize, had a very clear clause about nuisance and harassment, and what she had just done was a textbook definition. I reached down and gave Judge a soft pat on the head. His growl subsided to a low, chest-rumbling hum. She had brought the fight to me. Now, I was going to bring it back to her, with interest. The shouting from the porch escalated. "We know you're in there! Open the door! This is official HOA business!" It was comical. Official HOA business doesn't happen at 3 a.m. with hired goons. Police serve warrants, process servers deliver summons. HOA presidents with a Napoleon complex send out-of-work actors in security costumes. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. My voice was level, the product of years of training to remain calm under pressure. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was professional, bored. My name is Alex Carver. I live at 125 Chestnut Lane. There are 2 men on my front porch, dressed in some sort of security uniform, attempting to force entry into my home. They are banging on the door and demanding I come out. I believe I am in danger. I gave her a clear, concise summary. No emotion, just facts. She asked if they were armed. One is carrying a large, heavy flashlight and is holding it like a weapon. I can't confirm other weapons. They're shouting that it's HOA business. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the dispatcher's incredulous eye roll. "Sir, did you say HOA business?" "That's what they're claiming," I confirmed. "I'm telling you, I'm concerned for my safety." The pounding continued. "Last chance, Carver." As the dispatcher assured me that officers were en route, I walked to the front door. My dogs, Judge and Jury, were now sitting perfectly still, their bodies coiled like springs. They weren't barking, which was far more terrifying. A silent Malinois is a thinking Malinois, and they were waiting for my cue. I flicked on the powerful exterior floodlights, bathing the 2 wannabe commandos in brilliant white. They flinched, shielding their eyes. Now I could see them clearly through the peephole. The one with the maglite was doughy, his tactical vest stretched taut over a substantial belly. The other was wiry and nervous, shifting from foot to foot. Their confidence seemed to evaporate under the sudden glare. I spoke through the door, my voice loud and clear, projecting authority. "You are on private property. You have not been invited. The police have been called and are on their way. I advise you to return to your vehicle and wait for them." The doughy one, clearly the leader, regained a sliver of his bluster. "We're with Citadel Security. We're contracted by the Homeowners Association. We're here to discuss your delinquent account." "Discuss it? At 3 a.m.? By trying to beat my door down?" I let out a short, sharp laugh. "You're trespassing. Leave now, or you will be charged." His partner, the wiry one, looked terrified. He tugged on the leader's arm. "Maybe we should just wait in the car, man. This feels wrong." "Shut up, Kevin." The leader hissed back. "She said he was just some quiet guy. A pushover." The distant but rapidly approaching wail of sirens cut through the night. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The effect on my 2 visitors was instantaneous. Panic. Doughboy's face went pale. Kevin, the wiry one, was already backing away from the door, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender to an unseen enemy. "Cops? You called the cops?" The leader stammered through the door. This is a civil matter. Not anymore, I called back. When you try to break into someone's house in the middle of the night, it becomes a criminal matter. Imagine that. 2 squad cars from the local sheriff's department screamed onto our quiet street, their blue and red lights painting the houses in strobing flashes of color. I saw neighbors' lights flick on, curtains twitching. Brenda's attempt at quiet intimidation had just become the neighborhood's primetime entertainment. Through the peephole, I watched as 2 deputies got out of their cars, hands resting on their sidearms, their expressions all business. They took in the scene. The 2 men in their absurd costumes, the house lit up like a stadium, the distinct sound of a very large dog's low growl now audible from the porch. One of the deputies, a tall man with a calm demeanor, took the lead. "Evening, gentlemen. Care to explain what's going on here?" The leader of my cosplay security team tried to salvage the situation. He puffed out his chest. "Officer, thank God. We're from Citadel Security. We're here on behalf of the HOA. This resident," he gestured dramatically at my door, "is delinquent on his dues and has been causing trouble." The deputy's gaze was flat. "Citadel Security? Never heard of you. You have a license to operate as a security service in this county?" The man fumbled in his vest, pulling out a laminated card. The deputy took it, glanced at it, and then shone his flashlight on it. He then turned to his partner. "Run this," he said, handing him the card. To the security guard, he asked, "What's the nature of this trouble that requires a 3 a.m. house call? He owes over $200 in fines." The man said, as if this explained everything. The deputy stared at him for a long moment. $200? And you thought kicking his door at 3 in the morning was the appropriate response? You know what we call that? It's called attempted breaking and entering, or at the very least, criminal menacing. It was at that moment I decided to make my appearance. I opened the door. Judge and jury were at my sides, sitting perfectly, their intense gaze fixed on the 2 men on the porch. The effect was immediate. Both guards took a step back. The deputies, to their credit, didn't flinch, but their eyes widened slightly. They recognized working dogs when they saw them. "Evening, deputies," I said calmly. "I'm Alex Carver. I'm the one who called. These 2 gentlemen were trying to force their way into my home." I explained the situation succinctly. The ridiculous fines, the HOA president's harassment, and this latest insane escalation. I handed them the stack of violation notices and my certified mail receipts for the letters I'd sent. The lead deputy's partner returned from his car. "Came back clean, for the most part," he said quietly to his partner. "Citadel Security is a licensed business, an LLC registered to a P.O. box, but their state security license expired 3 months ago. They're not legally allowed to perform guard services." The lead deputy's expression hardened. He turned back to the 2 guards, who now looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them. "So you're operating without a license. And you're impersonating security guards, which is another charge. And you're here, harassing this resident over a civil fine, which could be construed as extortion. This is not your lucky night." He then looked at me. "Mr. Carver, do you wish to press charges?" My mind was racing. Pressing charges against these 2 clowns was tempting, but they were just the pawns. They were the symptom, not the disease. The disease was Brenda. "Deputy," I said, "these 2 are just the hired help. They're idiots, but they were sent here. The person who sent them is the president of our HOA, Brenda Blackwell, at 112 Hemlock Drive. She's the one who contracted an unlicensed security firm to harass and intimidate me at my home in the middle of the night. That's who I want to talk about." A slow smile spread across the deputy's face. He understood. This was bigger than a couple of schmucks in tactical vests. "I see," he said. "Well, for starters, your 2 friends here are coming with us. We'll sort out their licensing issues downtown. As for the HOA president, we might just go have a chat with her. Waking people up seems to be the theme of the evening." As the deputies cuffed the 2 men, who offered no resistance, Brenda's husband, Gary, came shuffling out of their house down the street, wrapped in a fluffy white bathrobe. He looked bewildered, blinking in the flashing lights. He saw the deputies. He saw me standing with my dogs. and he saw the two guards being placed in the back of a squad car. The look on his face was a perfect blend of fear and confusion. Brenda had sent her soldiers to fight a battle, and they had been captured within minutes. This wasn't the end. This was the opening salvo of a much larger war. And I had just captured their scouts and learned the name of their general. The police report I filed that night was the first official document in what would become a mountain of evidence. The game had changed. It was no longer about a hose or a flag. It was about dismantling a corrupt and abusive system, piece by piece. My research into the HOA bylaws was about to be supplemented by a deep dive into criminal statutes. Brenda wanted a fight. She had no idea I was about to give her one she could never win. The immediate aftermath of the 3 a.m. incident was a beautiful, deafening silence from Brenda. The flashing police lights on our quiet suburban street had been like a giant neon sign advertising her spectacular failure. For the next few days, she was conspicuously absent from her usual patrols in her white Lexus. Gary scurried to and from his car, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The neighborhood was buzzing. I received a few tentative supportive texts from neighbors, including Mike, who sent a simple, "Holy cow, dude. You have my respect." It was a start. But I knew this was just a temporary retreat, not a surrender. A bully like Brenda doesn't learn from mistakes. She only learns to escalate. I had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. My objective now was total victory. I didn't just want to be left alone. I wanted to dismantle her reign of terror for the good of the entire neighborhood. My military training had taught me that winning a conflict requires superior intelligence. Brenda thought the HOA bylaws were her weapons. I was about to show her what a real intelligence operation looked like. My living room became my command center. I started by formalizing everything that had happened. I wrote a detailed chronological account of every interaction, every notice, every conversation, starting with the hose fine and culminating in the 3 a.m. attempted home invasion. I attached a copy of the police report, which I had picked up that morning. The report was a work of art. It officially named Brenda Blackwell as the individual who had hired the unlicensed Citadel security and dispatched them to my house. The deputies had, as promised, paid her a visit after they left my place. According to the report, she was uncooperative and belligerent, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. This document was my cornerstone. Next, I turned my attention to Citadel Security. A quick online search revealed they were as shady as I suspected. Their website was a joke, full of stock photos of serious-looking men in pristine uniforms who were clearly not the two goons I'd met. Their registered business address was a UPS store P.O. box. The owner was a man named Dirk Mastersonth, doughy guard from my porch. He had a string of failed businesses behind him, and, more interestingly, his personal blog detailed his belief in a citizen's right to enforce community standards. The guy was a wannabe vigilante. And Brenda had handed him a flimsy shield of legitimacy. I paid for a comprehensive background check on Dirk. The results were even better than I'd hoped. He had 2 prior misdemeanor convictions for impersonating an officer. This wasn't just an expired license. It was a pattern of behavior. He was a professional bully for hire. My next target was the HOA's finances. This was Gary's domain. As treasurer, he was complicit in everything Brenda did. According to the bylaws, any homeowner could request to inspect the financial records with 10 days written notice. I typed up a formal request, citing the specific bylaw, and asked to see all financial statements, invoices, and contracts for the past 2 years. I specifically requested the contract and payment records for Citadel Security. I sent it via certified mail to every single board member, not just Gary and Brenda. I wanted to put them all on notice. This was when my first true ally emerged. It wasn't Mike, who was still too timid, but his wife Sarah. She caught me at my mailbox a few days after I sent the letter. Her eyes were bright with a kind of conspiratorial glee. "I heard what you're doing," she said in a hushed, excited tone. "Requesting the financials. It's brilliant. They never think anyone will actually do it." She told me she used to be on the board years ago, before Brenda and Gary consolidated power. I resigned in protest, she explained. Gary's accounting is creative. He presents these neat little summaries at the annual meeting, but no one ever sees the actual receipts. Brenda gets him to approve anything she wants. A new landscape enhancement that's just a bunch of expensive mulch for her own flower beds. Administrative costs that are just gift cards to her favorite restaurants. This was gold. Sarah was my insider. She continued, "There's something else you should look for. About a year and a half ago, they levied a special assessment of $500 per household. It was supposed to be for resurfacing the neighborhood tennis courts. The courts are still cracked and covered in weeds, but the money's gone." When anyone asked, Brenda said there were unexpected preparatory costs. She gave me the name of the original contractor who had given the board an estimate before being mysteriously replaced. A company called Pristine Paving. I thanked Sarah profusely. She had just handed me a treasure map. I knew this was risky for her, so I assured her I would keep her name out of it completely. She just nodded. "Just burn it all down, Alex," she said with a grim smile. While I waited for the 10-day period for the financials to elapse, I focused on the structure of the HOA itself. I drove to the county records office and pulled the original plat maps and articles of incorporation for our development. I spent hours cross-referencing documents, learning about easements, common areas, and the legal framework that gave the HOA its power. I discovered that the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street where I had been cited for my veterans flag was, actually, a public utility easement owned by the city, not HOA common property. The HOA had no jurisdiction over it. They had been fining people for years for things they had no authority to regulate. Every piece of information was a bullet. I was building an arsenal. I created a separate file for each of Brenda's likely transgressions. File 1, Harassment and Intimidation, containing my statement and the police report. File 2, Financial Malfeasance, which currently contained Sarah's testimony and a placeholder for the records I had requested. File 3, Abuse of Authority, which detailed the procedural violations and my new discovery about the city easement. Then, I did something Brenda would never anticipate. I started talking to my neighbors, not just to complain, but to listen. I took judge and jury for long walks around the neighborhood every evening. The dogs were great icebreakers. People would stop to ask about them, and it would open the door for conversation. I heard stories that made my blood boil. An elderly widow, Mrs. Gable, was fined because a windstorm had knocked a few shingles off her roof, and she was cited for lack of maintenance before the insurance adjuster had even arrived. A young family was ordered to remove a basketball hoop from their own driveway because Brenda claimed it lowered the aesthetic character of the street. Each story was the same, a petty grievance weaponized into a stressful, expensive ordeal by an unaccountable tyrant. I took careful, anonymous notes of each story, asking for copies of the violation letters if they still had them. I was no longer just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Mrs. Gable. I was fighting for the family with the basketball hoop. I was fighting for the Gallaghers who had been driven out. On the 10th day after my request for the financials, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't from Gary. It was from the HOA's lawyer. It was a classic legal threat letter. It accused me of a campaign of harassment against the board members. It stated that my unreasonable and burdensome request for financial records would not be honored, citing a non-existent clause about protecting vendor privacy. And it informed me that the HOA was now placing a lien on my property for the unpaid fines, plus newly added attorney's fees, bringing my grand total owed to a little over $1,500. It was a bluff, a big, stupid, arrogant bluff. They thought a letter from a lawyer would scare me into backing down. They had just confirmed everything I suspected. They were hiding something. The refusal to provide the financials was not just a violation of the bylaws. It was a massive red flag. And threatening a lien? That was the final escalation. That was a direct attack on my home, on my biggest financial asset. It was the dumbest thing they could have possibly done. Because now, this wasn't just a matter for the HOA board or even the local police. By placing an illegal lien, they had brought this into the realm of real estate law and potential bank fraud, as it could affect my mortgage. They had just given me the justification I needed to bring in my own lawyer. And unlike their small-town legal bully, my guy played in a different league entirely. I picked up the phone and made the call. The defensive phase was over. It was time to go on the attack. The lawyer's letter was Brenda's declaration of total war, and I was more than prepared to meet her on the field. I called a friend from my military days, a guy named Ben who had left the service to get his law degree and now worked for a fairly prestigious firm in the city. Ben specialized in corporate and contract law, but he had a pit bull's tenacity and loved a good fight, especially against a bully. I laid out the whole story for him over the phone, from the garden hose to the lien threat. I could hear him practically salivating through the receiver. "Alex, this is beautiful," he said, his voice alight with professional excitement. "This isn't just an HOA dispute. This is a case study in fiduciary, duty gone, wild. They've done everything wrong. The unlicensed security, the denial of financial records, the illegal fines, the jurisdictional overreach on the city easement, and now an illegal lien? It's a house of cards, man. A big, ugly, tacky house of cards." I sent him my entire file, the police report, my chronological narrative, the photos, the HOA bylaws with my highlighted sections, my background check on Dirk Masterson, and the threatening letter from the HOA's lawyer. Ben called me back a day later. "Okay, I've reviewed everything. Their lawyer is a joke. His letter is all posture, no substance. He's probably a buddy of Brenda's who does real estate closings and thinks that makes him a litigator. We're going to tear him apart." Ben's strategy was multifaceted and aggressive. Step 1 was to counter the lien. He drafted a blistering response to the HOA's lawyer. It was a masterpiece of legal prose, simultaneously polite and utterly menacing. It pointed out that placing a lien for disputed and improperly levied fines was illegal under state law. It demanded the immediate removal of the threat and a written apology. It also put them on notice that any attempt to file the lien would be met with a lawsuit for slander of title, seeking both actual and punitive damages. "This will put their lawyer on his heels," Ben explained. "He knows we're right. He'll have to advise Brenda to back down on the lien, and if she refuses, he'd be committing malpractice to proceed. That's a shot across his bow." Step 2 was to force their hand on the financial records. Ben sent a separate, formal demand letter, this time from his law firm, not from me. It gave them 7 days to provide full and unfettered access to all the records I had requested. The letter cited the specific state statutes that superseded the HOA bylaws, making the denial of records not just a violation of their own rules, but a violation of state law. The letter concluded by stating that failure to comply would result in a lawsuit to compel discovery, and we would seek to have the HOA pay all of our legal fees, which, as Ben dryly noted, were considerably higher than their own lawyers. Step 3 was my personal favorite. It was the covert operation. "We need more than just their financial documents," Ben said. "We need to document a pattern of behavior. I want you to become the most meticulous record keeper in the history of suburban disputes." He instructed me to install high-quality, motion-activated security cameras covering the front of my house. "Not cheap ones," he specified. "Get good HD, night vision-capable ones. I want crisp video of every time Brenda, Gary, or any of their cronies so much as sets foot on your property or the public sidewalk in front of it." He also had me get a small, discreet body camera. "Wear it anytime you're outside. If Brenda approaches you, if Gary is lurking with his ruler, I want it recorded, audio and video." State law here is one-party consent, so as long as you're part of the conversation, it's perfectly legal. I became a walking surveillance unit. I installed 4 high-end cameras that gave me overlapping fields of fire on my entire front yard, the street, and a clear view of Brenda's house. I bought a body camera that looked like a pen in my pocket. The new hardware paid dividends almost immediately. A few days after Ben sent his letters, the predictable escalation occurred. Brenda couldn't use her fake cops anymore, so she resorted to more direct harassment. One morning, I woke up to find my front lawn littered with trash, not just a few pieces, but what looked like the entire contents of a garbage can dumped across the grass. The cameras had caught it all. At 2:17 a.m., a familiar white Lexus SUV had driven slowly past my house. It stopped just out of the frame of the front-facing camera, but the one covering the side yard caught the passenger door opening. A figure whose size and shape perfectly matched Gary's got out, scurried to the back of the SUV, and then walked toward my lawn with a large trash bag. A few minutes later, he ran back to the car, and it sped off. It was grainy, but it was undeniable. Brenda, emboldened by ignorance or her lawyer's bad advice, also made a crucial error. She decided to confront me publicly. I was out front, checking my mailbox, with my pen cam running, of course, when she marched across her lawn and onto the public sidewalk. "Mr. Carver!" she barked. "I received a very nasty letter from your lawyer." "I'm sure you did," I said calmly. "You should probably have your lawyer respond to my lawyer, Brenda. That's how this works. Your harassment of this board is going to stop." She was practically shouting now. Several neighbors who were outside doing yard work stopped to watch. This was exactly what I wanted. "Brenda, requesting to see financial records, as is my right under the law, is not harassment," I said, keeping my voice even. "Sending unlicensed thugs to my door at 3 a.m., that's harassment. Filing an illegal lien on my home is harassment. Having your husband dump trash on my lawn in the middle of the night," I paused, letting the words hang in the air, "is harassment, and I have it all on video." The color drained from her face. Her perfectly constructed mask of indignant authority crumbled into pure, unadulterated shock. She looked from me to her house, as if she could see Gary cowering inside. She stammered, I don't know what you're talking about." She had no idea about the cameras. She thought it was her word against mine. "Oh, I think you do," I said, giving her a small, tight smile. "The video is very clear, as is the footage from the other night of your little friend, the one in the cheap tactical vest. The police found it very helpful. She was cornered, exposed in front of her subjects. Her power was derived from the illusion of untouchability, and I had just shattered it on a public sidewalk." She spun on her heel and practically ran back to her house, the whispers of the neighbors following her like a flock of birds. The showdown was coming. The 7 days for the financial records were almost up. Ben was preparing the lawsuit. Sarah had called me with another tip. She told me the date of the next HOA board meeting. It was in 10 days. "It's usually just her, Gary, and Carol in Brenda's living room," she said. "But the bylaws state that any homeowner can attend if they give 48 hours notice. You should go. You should bring friends." It was the perfect stage for the final act. I wasn't just going to sue them. I was going to humiliate them. I was going to strip them of their power in front of the very people they had terrorized for so long. The battle of letters and threats was over. It was time for a public execution. The plan for the HOA board meeting was meticulously orchestrated by Ben and me. It was a classic pincer movement. On one front, Ben would be filing the lawsuit that very morning. On the other front, I would be attending the board meeting that evening, armed with evidence and a small army of awakened neighbors. The lawsuit was a work of art. It named Brenda Blackwell and Gary Blackwell personally, along with the HOA as an entity. This was a critical step, as it meant they couldn't just hide behind the HOA's corporate shield. Their personal assets were now on the line. The suit alleged breach of fiduciary duty, violations of state nonprofit corporation laws, harassment, conspiracy to commit extortion, related to the unlicensed security guards, and sought to invalidate the lien and all associated fines. It also formally petitioned the court to appoint a third-party receiver to take over the HOA's operations and conduct a full forensic audit, citing the board's refusal to release financial documents as evidence of potential fraud. The morning of the meeting, Ben had a process server deliver the summons to Brenda and Gary at their home. I would have paid good money to see their faces. The second part of the plan was mobilizing the neighborhood. For years, Brenda's power had relied on the classic divide and conquer strategy. People were too afraid or apathetic to challenge her alone. I needed to show them they weren't alone. I spent the 2 days before the meeting going door to door. I didn't lead with my personal vendetta. I led with their own stories. I went to Mrs. Gable, the widow with the shingles. I went to the family with the basketball hoop. I went to Mike and Sarah. To each of them, I presented a simple, factual case. Brenda and Gary have been misusing our funds and harassing residents for years. I have proof. I have filed a lawsuit to stop them. But a judge in a courtroom is one thing. What we need to do is take back our own neighborhood. The board meeting is tomorrow night. By law, we are all allowed to attend. Will you come with me? I showed them the evidence. The clip of Gary dumping trash on my lawn was particularly effective. Seeing the treasurer of the HOA engaged in such a petty, vindictive, and frankly criminal act was a tipping point for many. Sarah was instrumental. She knew everyone's story and helped me connect with people who had been too afraid to speak up before. By the time the evening of the meeting rolled around, I didn't have a small army. I had a platoon. There were nearly 30 of us. We met at the end of the block and walked together to Brenda's house. It was a quiet, determined procession of suburban revolutionaries. We arrived at 112 Hemlock Drive at 6:55 p.m. for the 7:00 p.m. meeting. Brenda's house was, as always, immaculate on the outside. We walked up the driveway and rang the doorbell. Gary opened the door, a clipboard in his hand. He was expecting me. He was not expecting the other 29 homeowners standing behind me. His face, already pale and drawn, went ashen. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "We're here for the board meeting," I said, my voice pleasant. Gary stammered, "This is a board meeting, not a town hall. There's no room." "Oh, I think we'll manage," I said, stepping past him into the foyer. "The bylaws don't specify a maximum attendance, Gary. We'll make do." The others filed in behind me. We filled their foyer, their hallway, and spilled into their cavernous living room, a space decorated in sterile shades of beige and gold. Brenda was sitting on a pristine white sofa next to her loyal enabler, Carol. Her composure was ironclad, but I could see the panic flickering in her eyes as homeowner after homeowner entered her personal sanctuary. She had lost control of the situation before it had even begun. She stood up, smoothing her silk blouse. "This is highly irregular. The agenda is set, and there is no time for public comment." "We're not here for public comment, Brenda," I said, stepping to the front of the group. "We're here to observe, and also to deliver some news." I held up my phone, with the video of Gary's late-night trash run queued up. "But first, I believe we need to address agenda item number 1, which is usually the approval of the previous meeting's minutes. I, however, propose a new agenda item, the immediate removal of the president and treasurer for cause, as outlined in Bylaw 7.4. A murmur went through the crowd of neighbors. They didn't know this was coming. Brenda scoffed. "You can't just do that. It requires a vote of the full membership at the annual meeting." "Actually," I said, pulling a folded paper from my pocket, Bylaw 7.4 states the board can be removed for gross negligence or malfeasance by a 2/3 vote of the members present at any official meeting, provided a quorum is met. A quorum is 20% of the membership. We have more than 20% right here in your living room. I had spent the afternoon collecting signed proxies from other neighbors who couldn't attend but wanted their voices heard. I had enough votes to remove them twice over. Carol, the third board member, looked like she was about to faint. This was far beyond her pay grade of approving fines for unapproved petunias. Brenda's face was a mask of fury. "This is an illegal coup. You have no right." "Speaking of illegal," I said, my voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "let's talk about Citadel Security, an unlicensed firm you hired with our money to intimidate and harass a resident. Or should we talk about the $500 special assessment for the tennis courts that were never repaired?" I turned to the assembled homeowners. "Did you know that? She took $500 from every single one of us to fix the courts. I spoke with the original contractor, Pristine Paving. Their bid was for the full amount." They were told the HOA had gone in a different direction. Where did that money go, Brenda? She was speechless. I then turned to Gary. And you, Gary, did you think no one would see you dumping garbage on my lawn like a delinquent teenager? Let's watch. I played the video on my phone. The room was silent, except for the audio of the wind and the rustling of the bag. We all watched the shadowy figure of the HOA treasurer commit his pathetic act of vandalism. When it was over, Gary wouldn't look up from the floor. He seemed to shrink into himself. Finally, I said, turning my attention back to the group, this morning, a lawsuit was filed against Brenda and Gary Blackwell personally. For everything. The harassment, the financial mismanagement, all of it. I let that sink in. I looked at Carol. Carol, you're the last remaining board member who isn't being sued. The choice is yours. You can go down with the sinking ship, or you can call for a vote. Carol looked at Brenda, then at the 30 angry faces staring at her, then back at me. She swallowed hard. I second the motion, she whispered. A motion for the removal of the president and treasurer. The rest was a blur of righteous, democratic fury. One by one, homeowners who had been silent for years stood up and spoke. Mrs. Gable, her voice trembling but firm, detailed how Brenda had threatened her while she was grieving her husband. The young father talked about how his son cried when they had to take down his basketball hoop. It was a floodgate of repressed frustration and anger. When it came time to vote, the result was unanimous. Brenda and Gary were stripped of their titles and their power in their own living room, surrounded by the people they had lorded over. Brenda didn't scream or cry. She just sat there, rigid, her face a terrifying, blank canvas of defeated rage. The king and queen had been deposed. The castle had been stormed. And their reign was officially and finally over. The downfall of Brenda and Gary Blackwell was as swift as it was brutal. Following the vote in her living room, there was a stunned silence. Brenda just stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Gary looked like he was having a medical event. Carol, the newly promoted de facto head of the HOA, was so far out of her depth she was in danger of getting the bends. It was Sarah, Mike's wife, who stepped up. Having served on the board before, she knew the procedure. We need to formally adjourn this meeting, she announced to the room. And we need to schedule an emergency general meeting to elect a new board. We also need to secure all of the HOA's records immediately. I looked at Gary, who was still catatonic. Gary, I said, my voice calm but firm. The laptop, the checkbook, the financial records. Now. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He shuffled over to a small office off the living room and returned with a laptop, a large accordion file, and a checkbook binder. He handed them over to Sarah as if they were radioactive. The symbolism was potent, the instruments of their power, handed over in disgrace. The lawsuit Ben filed acted like a shark in the water. Once the news got out that Brenda and Gary were being sued personally, their world collapsed. The HOA's lawyer, the one who wrote the blustering letters, dropped them as clients within 48 hours, citing a clear conflict of interest and their failure to heed his advice, a blatant attempt to save his own skin. Faced with a mountain of evidence and no legal counsel willing to touch their case, they were forced into a settlement. The terms were devastating for them and a total victory for the neighborhood. First, they had to pay my legal fees in full. Second, they had to personally pay back every illegal fine they had ever levied against me, plus damages for the harassment, totaling around 10-0. Third, and this was Ben's masterstroke, the settlement included a non-disparagement clause that was heavily weighted in our favor. They were legally forbidden from speaking ill of me or any other resident, but we were under no such obligation. And the final, most satisfying term, they had to sell their house and move out of the neighborhood within 6 months. The court-appointed receiver confirmed everything Sarah had suspected and more. The forensic audit was a bloodbath. Gary's creative accounting was, in reality, blatant embezzlement. The landscaping enhancements were indeed for Brenda's yard. The administrative costs were for spa days, expensive dinners, and even a down payment on Brenda's Lexus. The missing $500 special assessment for the tennis courts had been funneled into a separate account under a company name that was traced back to Gary's cousin. All told, they had skimmed nearly $85,000 from our community funds over 5 years. The receiver's report was submitted to the district attorney's office, and criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement were filed against both of them. The emergency meeting to elect a new board was a breath of fresh air. It was held in the community clubhouse, a building Brenda had kept locked and reserved only for her private functions. We had a huge turnout. I was nominated for president, but I respectfully declined. I didn't want the job. I just wanted to live in peace. My mission was accomplished. I did, however, agree to serve as an advisor to the new board, to help them redraft the bylaws. Sarah was elected president by a landslide. Mike became the new treasurer, with a mandate to make every single transaction completely transparent on a new community website. Mrs. Gable, filled with a newfound sense of purpose, volunteered to head up the architectural committee, vowing it would only ever be used to offer helpful advice, not to punish people. The entire culture of the neighborhood changed almost overnight. The new board's first act was to declare a 6-month moratorium on all fines. Their second was to go through the bylaws with a red pen. We eliminated the vague, subjective rules about aesthetics and community character. We clarified the fining process to require multiple warnings and a homeowner's right to be heard at an open meeting. We explicitly protected things like flying the American flag, planting vegetable gardens, and children's play equipment. We turned a weapon of oppression into a document of common-sense community living. The tennis courts were resurfaced a month later, using money recovered from the settlement. On the day they reopened, the whole neighborhood came out. There was a potluck. Kids were playing, and people were laughing. It felt like we had been liberated. Brenda and Gary's house went on the market 5 months after the fateful meeting. They sold it at a loss to get out from under the coming legal storm. The last time I saw them, they were loading a U-Haul in silence, refusing to look at any of the neighbors who drove past. They looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the arrogance and power that had defined them. The new family that moved in was lovely, with 2 young kids who immediately put up a basketball hoop in the driveway. No one said a word, except to welcome them to the neighborhood. As for my 2 favorite canines, judge and jury became local celebrities. They were the stoic, furry heroes who had stood their ground. They got more than their fair share of steak that month. In the end, it was never about the 22 fine. It was about the simple, fundamental principle that you shouldn't be a jerk. It was about standing up to a bully, not just for yourself, but for everyone who was too scared to. Brenda's mistake was thinking her little HOA was a kingdom and that the bylaws were her divine right. She failed to understand that real power doesn't come from a title or a rulebook. It comes from the respect of your community. And that's something she never had and never will. My advice to anyone dealing with a power-tripping HOA Karen: read the bylaws, document everything, talk to your neighbors. And remember that the system can be used to protect you just as easily as it can be used to persecute you. You just have to be more patient, more meticulous, and more determined than the person trying to make your life miserable. Thanks for sticking through this wild ride. It just goes to show you that sometimes, when you push someone too far, they push back, and they might just have a couple of 4-legged friends ready to back them up. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories of justice served cold.